Well, I wonder if you've ever found yourself in an unexpected time of waiting, or in a time of uncertainty, deep uncertainty. I wonder if that might be where you're at right now, that's something that you are struggling with. I don't mean, of course, waiting for a bus, or waiting at the traffic lights, or waiting for an Amazon delivery, all of which can be, I know, very frustrating, especially if we're in a hurry. I'm thinking more perhaps of a fall, or an illness, or an unexpected event in your life that causes havoc with that well-planned diary and stops you in your tracks. Or a time of unknown when the future, or perhaps even the present right now for you, feels very unclear, maybe a house move or a change of career, and there just seems to be no obvious way out, no obvious way forward. I wonder what happens for you when you're in that time, in that space of waiting and uncertainty. Do you have those questions? Where are you, God? Where's God right now? Do you have those questions? Why are you allowing this to happen? We so easily go there, don't we? Or perhaps sometimes, like me, you might slip into a bit of bitterness or resentment, or become just generally a bit grumpy with life. Or maybe that's just me. I don't know. Or perhaps you're one of those people that is always looking for a way forward. You know, I'm not going to stop here. I will find a way out. You're looking. You're going to change things somehow. Or perhaps during waiting and uncertainty, we try to lean into God. We know that that's the place to go. We try and go there. We long to trust him, even in our confusion. But the truth is, it's often only when we look back, isn't it, that we see how our faith has grown, how we've strengthened through that difficult time. How actually God was there all the time, that he was working out his purposes. We just couldn't see it at the time. Well, for the past 2 weeks, we've been with the Apostle Paul, and he is in a time of waiting. He is in a time of deep uncertainty, and he can't see how things are going to work out. For those who are visiting with us, we're camping out in the last few chapters of Acts for our summer series, and so we've been looking at Luke's account of the early church through Acts, and that is where we've found Paul. He's been obedient to Jesus, hasn't he? He's been obedient in following Jesus. He's been obedient in following that command to share the good news, the resurrection of Jesus. Paul is going out into the world, wanting to share this wonderful message. And what we're discovering is he keeps meeting opposition, people who don't want to hear it, don't want to enter into what he's discovered. This is the great Apostle Paul with his calling on his life to take this good news out to the waiting world. And he's stuck in a prison cell. He can't go anywhere. He is in a time of deep uncertainty and waiting. I love Tom Wright, the theologian. He says this, for a travelling apostle to be in prison must seem like a concert pianist having his hands tied behind his back. I think that sums up how Paul must be feeling right now. And I wonder if that might sum some of us up this morning, some of us here this morning. We've got so much to do for God, but we're hindered by looking after an elderly relative. We've got so much to do for God, but we're in so much constant pain. Even getting up in the morning is a challenge. We've got so much to do for God, but whenever we try, whenever we take a step forward, another door seems to close, another no, another disaster. Well, I think Paul has something to say to us if we're feeling like that this morning. So here's Paul, still in prison, still being falsely accused. And we've been, if you've been here for the last 2 weeks, on this roller coaster with him, haven't we? Being arrested in Jerusalem, chapter 23, accused by the Jews, they even want to kill him. He's transferred to Caesarea, chapter 24, interrogated day after day by the Roman governor of Judea, Felix. And Felix, we left him in chapter 24, being detained by Felix for his own good pleasure. He had no evidence to hold him, no grounds whatsoever, but he wanted him there. He was pandering to the Jews, wasn't he? Felix, Duncan showed us last week, was consumed with this love of power. He doesn't act to save Paul, even though he knows Paul is innocent. He's pandering to the Jews. He wants to be popular. 2 years later, it might be only a week for us, but it's 2 years from Acts 24 to Acts 25, and we get to the next part of the story, and we find that Paul is still in prison. He's that concert pianist with his hands tied behind his back. No fair trial, no evidence to charge him. And Felix is hoping that by keeping him there, he might offer him a bribe. Felix might get some money out of Paul. It's all a love of power. But what Duncan told us last week is that Paul meets this love of power with the power of love, doesn't he? If you haven't heard last week's message, listen online, it's brilliant. He takes every opportunity, Paul, that this uninvited, unplanned captivity that he's now in, to share the gospel, to share the good news of Jesus. He keeps on talking about the resurrection of Jesus. So we're going to step into this reading, and we're going to have another dramatized reading. I'm very grateful for my actors who are joining me this morning. So we've got Duncan and David who are going to come and join me. And Duncan, who are you going to be this morning?
I'm going to be Paul this morning.
So you're Paul this morning. And who are you going to be, David? Yes, you need a microphone. Well done.
I do, yes. I'm Festus.
So Festus has replaced Felix. That's how it works. So Felix was not in power for very long before he was replaced by Festus. So enjoy our little drama for you this morning. 3 days after Festus arrived in the province, he went from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders brought their charges against Paul. They begged Festus to do them a favor of bringing Paul to Jerusalem, for they had made a plot to kill him on the way. Festus answered,
Paul is being kept a prisoner in Caesarea, and I myself will be going back there soon. Let your leaders go to Caesarea with me and accuse the man if he has done anything wrong.
Festus spent another 8 or 10 days with them, and then he went to Caesarea. On the next day, he sat down in the court of judgment and ordered Paul to be brought in. When Paul arrived, the Jews who had come from Jerusalem stood around him and started making many serious charges against him, which they were not able to prove. But Paul defended himself.
I have done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against the Roman emperor.
But Festus wanted to gain favor with the Jews, so he asked Paul,
Would you be willing to go to Jerusalem and be tried on these charges before me there?
I am standing before the emperor's own court of judgment, where I should be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you yourself well know. If I have broken the law and done something for which I deserve the death penalty, I do not ask to escape it. But if there is no truth in the charges they bring against me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar.
Then Festus, after conferring with his advisers, answered him,
You have appealed to Caesar, so to the emperor you will go.
Sometime later, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to pay a visit of welcome to Festus. After they'd been there several days, Festus explained Paul's situation to the king.
There is a man here who has left a prisoner by Felix, and when I went to Jerusalem, the Jewish chief priests and the elders brought charges against him and asked me to condemn him. But I told them that we Romans are not in the habit of handing over a man accused of a crime before he has met his accusers face to face and has had the chance of defending himself against the accusation. When they came here then, I lost no time, but on the very next day I sat in the court and ordered the man to be brought in. His opponents stood up, but they did not accuse him of any of the evil crimes that I thought they would. All they had were some arguments with him about their own religion and about a man named Jesus who has died, but Paul claims he is alive. I was undecided about how I could get information on these matters, so I asked Paul if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and be tried there on these charges. But Paul appealed. He asked to be kept under guard and to let Caesar decide his case. So I gave orders for him to be kept under guard until I could send him to Caesar.
Agrippa said to Festus that he would like to hear this man Paul himself.
You will hear him tomorrow.
The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and ceremony and entered the audience hall with the military chiefs and the leading men of the city. Festus gave the order, and Paul was brought in. Festus said,
King Agrippa, and all who are here with us, You see this man against whom all the Jewish people, both here and at Jerusalem, have brought complaints to me. They scream that he should not live any longer, but I could not find that he had done anything for which he deserved the death sentence. And decided, since he had made himself an appeal to the emperor, I have decided to send him. But I have nothing definite about him to write to Caesar. So I have brought him here before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after investigating his case, I may have something to write. For it seems unreasonable to me to send a prisoner without clearly indicating the charges against him.
Oh, we give thanks to God for his word, don't we? And thanks to our actors here. Yeah, thank you so much. That's really brilliant, thank you. So, as I said, 2 years have passed. Felix has been removed from his position. He was a corrupt and brutal leader. We found that out last week. And we don't know much about this new Festus, apart from his Scottish accent now. But he's not in the same league as Felix. He seems much more reasonable and wanting to get this issue solved with Paul. And of course, like any new leader, new prime minister, he hits the ground running. He's wanting to meet his new team. He wants to get out into his constituency. So he quickly heads off to Jerusalem. He wants to meet the Jewish leaders there. And it's interesting, isn't it? When he gets to Jerusalem, what does he find? Right at the top of the agenda of these Jewish leaders, after 2 years, they are still full of hate and vengeance towards Paul. They still want to be rid of him. They want to kill him. These are religious leaders, folks. These are religious leaders. You would have thought, wouldn't you, after 2 years, that by now they might have found some peace. Might have thought, let bygones be bygones. Let's let this drop now. But no. And I'm not going to go into this now, but there's a warning here, isn't there, about hate and how it can get rooted in our lives and the damage that it does. But thankfully, Festus doesn't give in to their request, as we hear, to bring Paul to Jerusalem. We don't know, we're not told if he's aware of the plot to kill Paul, but he invites these disgruntled leaders. Well, you know, you come to me with and meet Paul in Caesarea, so that's what happens. And what we discover again is that Paul continues his defense with great respect, doesn't he, and great humility. I think personally I'd be fed up by now, 2 years stuck in a jail. I'd want some justice here, and he does, of course, but he's very respectful, very humble in the way that he behaves. And I wonder, what did he do in those 2 years? Well, we're not actually told, but there are other accounts of when Paul is in prison, particularly in Rome, and we find that he's praying, he's singing hymns, he's sharing the good news, no time wasted for Paul. And of course we know, don't we too, that a lot of the New Testament was actually written by Paul while he was in prison, while he was captive. And so here in chapter 24, we see Paul defending the truth, don't we? He's sharing with great wisdom, he's heralding justice, he's not rude, he's not retaliatory towards his accusers, but he's not a doormat either. He's not letting them walk all over him, and I think that's important. He speaks up. He wants justice, he wants a fair trial, and he knows that he's not going to get it from these Jews that he's stood in front of. So what does he do? He chooses to appeal to Caesar. He has the right to do that as a Roman citizen, to go to the emperor himself and be heard before the emperor. He knows there he will get a fair trial. Now this means that he will have a trip to Rome. Now, when I read that, this is what my whole sermon got based on, that Paul is going to go to Rome. Now, if you were here 2 weeks ago, do you remember the words that God spoke to Paul? If you don't, they're on the screen. Back in chapter 23, verse 11, in the middle of Paul's interactions with the Pharisees and Sadducees, a very similar situation that he's in now, God speaks to Paul and tells him that he's going to Rome. Let me read it to you. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Now, I don't think Paul had any idea, in the circumstances he's in right now, in this waiting, in this uncertainty, that all of that would lead him to Rome. But God was at work. In the most unexpected way, the door now opens. And Paul is able to do what God promised he would do in Rome, to testify to him in Rome. And I just wonder if that speaks to you this morning. If you're in that time of waiting, in that time of uncertainty, that time where life just doesn't seem to be making any sense, does that speak to you that God was planning it all? God was in control. He is at work. I want to explore that a bit more, if that's okay, because I got quite excited by this week. And it took me to some very familiar words in the letter to the Romans that Paul wrote. Words that I think you'll know well, many of you. And I found it very interesting that Paul actually wrote these words before he was in prison. And he wrote these words, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Paul sat and penned those words, he wrote those words. Now he's living them out. Now he is proving through this experience of waiting that in all things God is at work. Of course, we have the privilege of hindsight, don't we? So with Luke, we can look back and we can see how everything is fitting together to bring Paul to this point where he is now heading from Rome. But the Bible says in all things, God is at work, even through the sin, the evil of others, even in those disasters, the mistakes, the failures of life, in all things, God is at work. And what does this tell us? Well, it tells us, doesn't it, that life isn't a random mess, which actually sometimes it might feel like. Sometimes it might feel like that. This tells us that ultimately there are no accidents. God is at work even in the tiniest details of our lives. God is sovereign. He's in control. He's ruling and reigning in this universe. He's sustaining all things by his powerful word. How comforting, maybe for you this morning, for me this morning, to know that when nothing makes sense in our world, when we're in the middle of the muddle, if you like, that God hasn't abandoned us. He can't. We sang about that in our song just now, didn't we? He never fails. He never fails. He is at work. And not only is God at work in all things, but for the good of those who love him. We need to be careful, I think, often how we read this verse, because it's not a broad, everybody will be okay, don't worry, you will be happy, it will be all right in the end. It's not saying that. It's not a wand that we can wave over our lives. And I think it's a verse we have to be careful with pastorally as well. We can't just band it about when people are in a tough place. Don't worry, it's going to get better. I don't think that's what Paul's saying here. But I do think it's important, as one writer puts it, to recognize this verse can be a pillow to rest our weary heads on if we know and love God. I like that. That's a lovely verse that we can rest our heads on. Why? Because the promise is that in all things God works for the good. But this promise is made to those who love him. Those who love him. What does that mean? What does it mean? Do you truly love him this morning? Do I truly love God this morning? Is that a challenge to our hearts this morning? Love as in everything we have, everything we are is his. Love him because our heart is set on him alone. Love him because all we want to do is live to please him. He is above all else in our lives. Love him. Do we love him this morning? Because if we do love him like that, then we will know, as Paul says, that God is for us. Because I think the reality is, the truth is, that it's in the tough times, maybe in the waiting, in the difficult times, that we will actually demonstrate our love for God. Because I think we possibly will be prone to fail. Not to fail. We'd probably be prone to bail out, and to blame him when difficult times come. Because if we don't truly love him, we're not in relationship with him, then we can easily do that, can't we, rather than endure them. So let's go back to Paul's situation to help us understand this verse in Romans that he gives us. For at the moment, it would seem that things are not good for Paul. He's still in prison there, and it doesn't seem like they're going to get any better as he is still under guard captivity and will soon be in prison in Rome. But look, though, at Paul, because Paul has this incredible hope, doesn't he? That even in the middle of the muddle, his story, and he doesn't have the privilege of looking back as we do, his story right now, in the thick of it, even though he's trapped in a cell and he's not being listened to, he loves and trusts in God, doesn't he? He puts his trust in God, and he puts his trust in God's will and God's purpose for his life. In the middle of the muddle, he still loves God, because he knows that he is the one who promises that in all things will work together for the good of those who love God. So the question has to be how, doesn't it? How in the middle of our muddle can things work out for good? Well, I think there is a subtle clue in our reading this morning, and it's in verse 19. You'll have heard when Festus explains to Agrippa, doesn't he? He meets the king and he tells the king all about this issue with Paul. And he says that there's trouble caused by a disagreement about this. And this is the quote: "A dead man, Jesus, whom Paul claimed was alive." That was the issue, the sticking point for the Jews, for Paul's enemies, was that there was this dead man, and it would seem that Festus isn't quite sure who this dead man Jesus is yet. But Paul claims that he is alive, because Paul's hope is in Jesus and his resurrection. And that's the thread that goes throughout Paul's life, isn't it? It's the thread that's going to go through every preach through this summer series. It's what Paul talks about every day. It's what motivates him to keep going when life gets tough. Because Paul says we know that in all things, Paul loves God. Why? Because he knows and he understands the love of God. So I want to think about God's love that Paul is motivated by, in the hope that it'll motivate us again this morning. I don't know about you. I don't know about Luke. Can't ask him. But I wonder, as he penned these words about Paul, whether he had another unjust trial in his mind at the time. Because so much of the words reflect, don't they, the unjust trial of Jesus himself. I don't know, maybe go back home and read chapters 24 and 25, and you just get this sense, I know somebody else who went through this. Because like Paul, Jesus was unjustly accused, wasn't he? Jesus was imprisoned, he was tortured, he was held unfairly, without any convincing evidence at all. And of course, Jesus was eventually unjustly killed as well, wasn't he? All because of corrupt officials, unruly mobs, just like the ones that we've been meeting who have this love of power. And I'm sure Paul must have thought back to that story, the story of another Jew like him who was falsely accused and suffered. And you know, I think as Paul thought back about Jesus, that's where his hope came from. That's where he found hope, because he saw Jesus' death on the cross, the worst suffering and pain that anyone has ever endured, completely unjustly. Jesus never deserved that, was turned around and transformed by God. All things work together for good. Jesus' resurrection from the dead demonstrated without any doubt that God is sovereign, that God is in control, and that suffering and evil will never, ever have the last word. That God's plans will never be thwarted. All things work together for the good of those who love him. That's what Paul, I'm sure, he was so convinced of the resurrection of Jesus, wasn't he? That was his hope. He knew. That amazing gospel that I hope is yours. If it's not, I want to introduce you to Jesus this morning. Jesus is our hope. That is Paul's motivation when life gets tough. There's a lovely little verse in Philippians 1:12. I'll just read it to you. It's going to come up on the screen, hopefully. Now, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace garden to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. That's his motivation, that Jesus would be known. You know, Jesus demonstrates God's love for us. The Jesus who died, who led the way through pain and suffering, now motivates Paul to trust that whatever happens to him is going to be for his good. Why? Because he knows that he's loved by God. He's seen it. Because God has given everything for him in Jesus. And now what does he do? Well, he loves God with everything that he has. Can you see how it all fits together? And that's why Paul's able to say, and I hope we're able to say this morning, we know that to be true, that God has called us, and he will and can only, in all things, work for the good of those who love him. I wonder what Paul meant when he said, for our good, though. When he told the Romans it was for our good, because his experience doesn't sound that great, does it? And as the story unfolds, it doesn't get any better. So what does he mean that God works for the good of those who love him? Well, if we turn to Romans 8, and again, I think it's going to be on the screen. We don't have time to unpack because Paul uses lots of long theological, weighty words in Romans 8. But I just want to read the next verse, verse 29. Because he says, for those God foreknew, he also predestined, and this is the bit, to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be, that's Jesus, might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. His desire is that we might become Jesus' brothers and sisters. Oh, I haven't even dug into that, but isn't that brilliant? I want to look at the conformed to the image of his Son. Paul's saying our good is not that the troubles will end necessarily in this life. They might, but that's not the good that Paul is talking about. And that helps us such a much bigger question of suffering, isn't it? But it helps us as we consider some of these things, that there is a good that Paul is talking about that can happen even in that time. And that is to be transformed to be like Jesus. That is God's goal and desire for us. Why? Because that means if we are transformed to be like Jesus, we will become all that he created and designed and planned for us to be. I think that is really exciting. You're not going to get that offer anywhere else, to become everything that God created and designed and planned you to be than through becoming more like Jesus. Because when we become more like Jesus, we begin to become complete and whole and righteous and blameless. All those things that God created us to be in his sight. And that is the purpose. That is the purpose that God has created us for. That's why Jesus went to the cross. Because to God that is so important that we become like his Son. Because there we find our true identity. We find our purpose. We find our meaning in life through him. And you know, everything fades in its significance. It doesn't make it any less significant, but it fades in its significance. Even that waiting that you might be in at the moment, even that uncertainty that might be just filling your life at the moment, even that pain, we discover that the gospel, the beautiful gospel of Jesus' death and resurrection is being worked out in our own lives. I say that, working it out in our lives, because as a pastor, as one of the pastors of this church, I have the absolute privilege of journeying with people through the difficult times in their lives. And I know many of you do with each other, as we've heard through home groups and so on as well. But even this week, so many times I've sat with people who are going through difficult times, times of uncertainty, times of waiting, times when life just doesn't make sense. And it's so wonderful when you hear them talk about the tough times and then they say, but I know that God won't fail me. I know that God is with me. I know that God won't let me down. And you see their faith growing. And this might be you this morning, that you might be in that tough time and you're able to say, but I know that God, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. If that's not your experience this morning, then we pray that it will be, that you will discover how much God loves you this morning. And you will discover that he is working for your good. So as we come to a close, I've got 3 little takeaways that I want to bring to you, and I invite the band to start coming back up as we just think about these 3 questions as we go into our last song, which just leads us beautifully into a time of response. And the first is that this wonderful truth that God is at work, that God is sovereign this morning. And if God is sovereign, then there's this wonderful promise that we can hold on to, that we are not alone. That whatever you might be facing this morning, you are not alone. Is that something you need to hear this morning? And I guess the question is, how does that challenge your outlook? How does that challenge you as you think about this week ahead maybe, when you think, actually, God's sovereign in my life today. God is here. I'm not alone. He's promised he'll never fail me. How does that change the way you view the situation that you're in? And that wonderful truth that we've been trying to tease out, and probably very poorly, but God works for the good of those who love him. I find this really challenging. Am I being changed? Am I allowing the difficult stuff of life to mold me and change me into the likeness of Jesus? Am I being shaped into his image or am I getting disgruntled and grumpy about the tough things? I'm actually seeing that God is at work and he loves me and he wants to do this for my good. I can trust him. And I love this truth, the gospel isn't just, I've repented of my sins and I've come to know Jesus, full stop. No, the gospel's working in us, through us, continually. It's what we see in Paul. And I wonder where for us this week might be the opportunities to see the gospel at work in our own lives, but how can we share that wonderful good news with those that we meet? He's sovereign, he's at work. And he wants us to share his good news with others. This is a beautiful song, and we're going to sing it in a moment or two. But this promise that we can pray to God if we want to is, I'll walk with you wherever you go. That's a difficult thing to say, isn't it? God might lead us into places we don't want to go. But this is the promise that we want to make to God this morning, that through tears and joys, I'll trust in you. Through tears and joys, I'll trust in you. Is that something that you want to say to God this morning? So just for a moment of quiet as Andrew plays, to give us a chance to respond to God in whatever he might have said to us through his word, and then Andrew will lead us in song together.